Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing revelations that the RCMP has used spyware on Canadians during investigations, as well as the legal and privacy concerns around this revelation. On-device investigation tools, or audits, enable police to access a phone or computer without a person knowing. This type of spyware allows the user to do everything from intercept messages and phone calls and even turn on the phone camera and microphone. One of the most infamous types of this technology is a program called Pegasus. The RCMP says it has not used Pegasus specifically, but it has used other similar technologies in 32 investigations since 2017. Is the use of this technology by police in Canada legal? If it is, should it be? And what privacy laws exist to protect us from government surveillance and spyware? We're joined today to discuss this topic with the Canadian Civil Liberties privacy expert, Brenda McPhail. Brenda, thanks so much for joining us today. What more can you tell us about this revelation about the RCMP's use of spyware technology?
Well, we still, despite the fact that there was a highly unusual summer sitting of the Parliamentary Committee on Privacy, Access to Information and Ethics, know relatively little more than we did at the point that we first heard about this when a question by a Conservative MP was answered on an order paper that was tabled very, very quietly in May of this year. And the RCMP, for the first time, revealed that they had been using this technology. An alert reporter caught sight of that order paper and reached out to a number of people, including me at CCLA, and eventually broke it near the end of June.
So we know that the RCMP says that they have not used Pegasus specifically, which is kind of a famous piece of technology that's been used by sort of totalitarian state actors. And we know that they say that specific program hasn't been used, but do we know what program they have used?
We do not. It's helpful to know that Pegasus, which is kind of the poster child for the potential for these tools to be misused, because as you say, authoritarian governments are well known to have been using them to spy on political dissidents, human rights defenders in their territories and globally.
And I think even corporate actors. I think it's been used on senior members of large American companies even.
Yes, also it's been used for commercial espionage, and it's been used by those governments not just against their own citizens, but for example, officials in embassies. So people in the U.S. Embassy, people from the U.S. in embassies are also known to have been targeted.
So we know it's been used in 32 investigations. Do we know anything about those investigations, about whether warrants were obtained for its use? I'd have to assume that a warrant was obtained if this was used by the RCMP.
Yeah, so the RCMP refused to tell the committee what investigations had been completed or were in progress that were using those tools. They did provide a sample of a warrant application of the kind that they would use. And they did say that they only ever used this tool with a warrant, and actually included the information that they admitted that it would be contrary to Canadian law and to the Charter if they were to ever use it without a warrant. So
Right. Yeah, of course, we have a right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And generally that involves, although in not all cases, it involves a search with a warrant. So if since the police did obtain a warrant for these cases, is that sufficient to protect the people who were surveyed from their right being violated? Is a warrant good enough, or is there something inherently unreasonable about this use of this type of technology?
That is exactly the question that we should all be asking, and that we should start demanding widespread public debate and conversation about. Spyware allows potentially unfettered access to everything on the devices that we rely on to go about our daily lives. Everything in any cloud account connected to that device. Everything that we say or do, to the extent that police can also turn on the microphones or use the cameras on these devices. Professor Ron Diebert from the Citizen Lab called this wiretap on steroids.
Yeah, seriously.
Right.
Brenda, we've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the RCMP's use of on-device surveillance technology, where basically they zombify a phone, and they can use a phone that belongs to someone else they're investigating to open the camera, turn on the microphone, scroll through the entire contents of the phone without that person knowing about it. Now, Brenda, in this case, the RCMP says that they had warrants. Is there any information about whether the warrant restricted what they could do with this on-device technology? As I gave those examples, like perhaps you could have a warrant that would limit them to simply opening some emails or observing incoming calls or wiretapping specific calls. These are all traditional investigative tools that might already be available, especially wiretaps. We're familiar with that. But what about turning on the microphone and the camera? I mean, what is the scope of these warrants when this technology is being deployed?
Another awesome question, to which the answer is we don't know, because while a sample warrant was released to the committee, we don't actually have copies of any warrants that are for any particular investigation. And as we know in the legal community, the devil is always in the details when it comes to these things. So for any particular investigation, investigators are going to have potentially a range of targets and potentially a variety of ways in which they want to conduct their surveillance. So it's really hard to even judge whether or not the warrants are reasonable, what capacities of the tools are being used, or any other detail about their use in the absence of more information.
Yeah, and that lack of information is certainly concerning. Brenda, I want to know I want you to paint a picture for us of how the use of this technology could go wrong, but what the maybe over the line uses are, what some nefarious uses by our own police could be. Because I know the response of some people is always going to be, people who have nothing to hide don't need to worry about this technology. Why do you think that's not the case?
Well, I think that we almost don't even need to go so far as to speculate on potential nefarious uses by our own police, because the reality is that in any investigation, simple mistakes can happen with no nefarious intent. These tools are super invasive. Whether or not it ends up being someone who is completely innocent of the allegations or suspicions, who is subject to this sort of incredibly granular and detailed surveillance for ultimately no cause, whether or not it's third parties associated with an individual under investigation whose information is also being swept up as part of investigations, either by having their own device tapped or simply by being within range in a home of someone else's device when the camera's turned on or when the mic goes live. These are devices that, if you think about the way you use your phone, chances are very good that you carry it from boardroom to bathroom to bedroom. So depending on when the devices happen to be turned on, when those mics or cameras are live, there's a wide range of invasions that could happen, not just to an accused or a suspect, but to anyone around them.
Yeah, it's certainly a really uncomfortable notion of, really it's this sense of Big Brother is watching, right? Now, the All-Party National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians has announced they're going to conduct what they call a framework review of the use of this technology. This is a separate committee from the Ethics Committee that already looked into this. So what should we expect from this committee, especially since they've already described the use of this surveillance as lawful?
Well, I think that the framing of an investigation is fundamentally important to what we can expect from it. And you're quite right in pointing out that framing gives rise to concern that there's really going to be a thorough deep dive into the implications of this technology. Because again, it's not just what can happen here, but what Canada is contributing to by participating in this sort of global spyware marketplace. We know that these tools are created by companies who are selling them to authoritarian governments. We know that these tools are being used to attack human rights defenders. In Canada, we know that there was a Canadian individual whose phones were infected by spyware, and information from those phones very likely contributed to the ultimate seizure and killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
Wow.
So there's Canadian connections to the ways that these technologies are used by others. That means we shouldn't be contributing to this market.
We've got to go to break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing revelations that the RCMP has used spyware in a number of investigations of Canadians. I'm discussing this with CCLA head of privacy, Brenda McPhail. So, Brenda, there have been calls to change the laws around surveillance in Canada. And, you know, this technology, we just don't have enough information about how it was used at this point to draw a conclusion about if it was used legally or not legally. There's a big lack of information. I think that's one of the main areas that seems to require change. What can you add to that? And what other changes might you recommend when it comes to new surveillance technology in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's reasonable to say that it is fundamentally appalling that the Privacy Commissioner of Canada learned about the RCMP use of this technology through a media report, rather than having a privacy impact assessment delivered to his office prior to the implementation of that technology. So, you know, the first calls would be for updates to the Privacy Act. And one of the big changes that needs to happen is we should be mandating privacy impact assessments for new or novel technologies that are going to be used for surveillance of people across Canada. We also could take a look at the law enforcement exemptions and rules in that law. But then we need to go beyond privacy law. We need to think really seriously about that transparency and accountability piece that you so rightly pointed out is core to this case. And CCLA's recommendation has been that we need some sort of an external review body, not the RCMP talking to other RCMP to decide if RCMP get to use the tool, which is a kind of oversight that they are starting now to introduce with their NTOP committee, but an actual multi-stakeholder group with privacy experts, civil society, academics, police officials, government officials, who could take a look at a systemic level at the new emerging tools for law enforcement surveillance, and have the sort of necessary ethical and legal and socially grounded conversations about whether they're fit for use in Canada. And then make recommendations that would determine whether or not police are allowed to start implementing them.
So in order to sort of guide our development of the law in this area, because this emerging technology, the law doesn't seem to have kept track with the technological advances. But are there any other countries we could turn to as examples where they might have better protections for privacy, better guardrails in place where surveillance technology is being deployed? What could be a model for us? Is anyone doing it right?
I'm not sure that there are many jurisdictions where law enforcement is really well constrained. In fact, in many ways, Canada has served as a model for other countries. CCLA belongs to an international network who tend to look up to Canadian laws and processes as a good model for a democratic state in dealing with these things, which makes it all the more terrible when we fail miserably to live up to those standards. But I mean, we do, when it comes to external oversight of police surveillance in particular, which is the core issue here, in New York State, they've started to establish the kind of external review body that I was describing, with a bunch of different actors external to the police to look at these texts. In New Zealand, there's another model where an advisory body has been completed, and they're looking at ways to make sure that technologies, even technologies that for investigative purposes might be reasonable to use in secret, get a thorough professional and external review.
One of the things I'm interested in is the guardrails on the procurement process itself. Because I know there was a lot of controversy around a facial recognition technology that was revealed some police departments had used. It was really just like something you could buy as an app, and it wasn't necessarily like a government procurement that took place, and they decided that this was a company that could be trusted and used. So what guardrails are there in place for surveillance technology in general, and were any of them in place with in this instant with the Pegasus style technology?
Because those are internal processes, again, we're back at that, I don't know. If you listen to the testimony of the RCMP officers before the Ethics Committee, they do say that consideration was given to the use of this technology. They also let slip that some version of it has been used not just since 2017 or 2018, as was actually revealed, but way back in 2002, potentially.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing revelations that the RCMP used spyware on Canadians during certain investigations. Now, Brenda, as you mentioned in the last segment, this is not the first time we have learned of the government using surveillance on Canadian citizens. And there have been a number of other high-profile examples. What can you tell us about those and how this new revelation fits in with those previous instances?
Well, this really genuinely isn't a one-off problem. It's a crisis of accountability, and that was the submission that the CCLA made before the Ethics Committee. And the reason we say that is precisely because this is yet the latest in a string of this kind of revelations where controversial and invasive technologies have been picked up. So Stingray technology or cell site simulators are tools that allow police officers to scoop up, to intercept the signals of all cell phones in a given radius. So it could be in a city like Toronto, thousands of people's devices could be diverted to one of these tools. And we didn't know that was happening till it was broken by the media. Clearview AI, which we've referred to, that's the name of the facial recognition tool that police were using without going through proper procurement processes. The RCMP themselves were taken to task by the Privacy Commissioner because the Commissioner's investigation determined that the way the software works, by scraping billions of images off the internet, was illegal under Canadian privacy law. And police agencies hadn't done their due diligence. It wasn't just the RCMP, it was police agencies across Canada. But the RCMP actually paid for a license for this product, as opposed to just using trial versions like other police forces did. But they hadn't done their due diligence to determine whether the tool was even lawful before they put it into operation. So these are big problems, and it's a pattern.
So, Brenda, surveillance is not new. The surveillance is something all governments from all time have always used. But so how would these new technologies, would they ever be justified as part of an investigation? What would an example be where something like this could happen, be used, this type of surveillance, and it be charter constitutionally compliant?
Well, I mean, it might surprise you to think that I believe there can be a case to be made for very highly constrained and intensively supervised use of these on-device investigative tools in a really narrow law enforcement or national security context. And that is in part because their use is a solution that avoids the even worse option that we hear about, which is providing a backdoor to the encryption that underlies the security that lets us all bank online and buy things online and communicate privately online. So if it's a choice between backdooring the security of the internet or allowing police warranted use in tightly constrained situations of a tool, it's worth a conversation, a public conversation about, what those narrow constraints are and what kind of cases and under what circumstances that should be allowed.
A conversation that's difficult to have if we don't have any of the information, though, right?
Yeah, and that's the problem. When these tools are kept secret, when their use is hidden from the public, when we find out in big media reveals, that does not create the kind of environment for a sober, considered, careful conversation about if these tools can ever be fit for purpose in a democracy. And if the answer is yes or maybe, then under what circumstances? But we're not having those conversations because our policing bodies persist in hiding the use of these technologies, claiming the need for investigative secrecy, when really the policies around acquiring and using invasive tools deserve public consideration and can be publicly considered without compromising investigative secrecy.
Well, Brenda, thank you so much for coming on today to share your concerns and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association's concerns. It's a fascinating topic. I look forward to seeing what these committees of Parliament do about the issue.
As do I.
We've heard today about how the RCMP has used spyware on Canadian citizens and about the dangers associated with the increasing use of surveillance technology. Are you concerned about the privacy implications of increased government and police surveillance? What limits can or should be put on its use? You be the judge. Thanks for watching. I'm Christine Van Gyn. And remember, a freer Canada starts with you.